experiences some operational challenges that can impact the effluent water quality. Oh, I'm getting an echo. I'm going to mute my sound. So the wastewater treatment facility experiences some operational challenges that can impact the effluent quality, particularly in terms of solids and polymer carryover, as well as seasonally inadequate UV treatment. So we're doing, or we have been doing, some optimization work to help improve the treatment and the overall quality of the effluent. So with CBCL and the town, we have identified 3 areas for optimization, including the dissolved air flotation system, where we're looking at determining an optimum polymer dose under various water quality conditions, as opposed to holding the polymer dose at a constant. For the bioreactors, we're looking at conducting an overall health assessment of the biomass or of the bugs within the reactor under the various water quality conditions that are experienced seasonally in town. And then finally, we're looking at the UV disinfection system, where we're determining an appropriate UV dose under these challenging water quality conditions that are experienced particularly in the summer months. So in terms of the dissolved air flotation, it's well known that removal of solids by dissolved air flotation processes require appropriate chemical doses. Currently, as I mentioned, the DAF system is operated at a constant polymer dose of 3 milligrams per liter, but the actual polymer dose required can be influenced by things like solids loading into the system. So as I mentioned before, we're looking at seeing if a variable polymer dose can improve the overall solids removal in the DAF process of the plant. So to do this, we used a bench scale jar tester. So our master's student, Sheila Fife, has been conducting jar tests on a regular basis since, I think, the fall of 2020. And she uses this jar tester unit pictured, where in each of the little beakers that you see, she adds wastewater from the equalization tank, and in each jar she adds a different polymer. And then after the DAF process happens, where the air is injected, she collects samples from each jar and measures things like the solids contents and the UV transmittance. So this figure here actually shows some more recent results that we got from testing that we did in June and July of 2021, when the influent solids content was fairly high at around 200 ppm. So each, you might have seen in the report that we wrote that we found that kind of during the fall and then the spring and the summer, solids loading conditions that were typically around 100 milligrams per liter per ppm of TSS or lower. We've identified that the polymer dose could potentially be reduced as low as 5 milligrams per liter. So she continued that testing under these higher solids conditions to see if that was still true. So on the left here, we have these graphs with navy blue colored bars, and those represent the suspended solids concentration as a function of the polymer dose, which is on the x-axis. So as I mentioned before, she added different amounts of polymer to those beakers in that bench scale system. So this represents the solids concentration in each beaker after she did the testing. So each set of graphs represents a different jar testing that she did in June or July of 2021. And on the right, we see the same thing, but instead of suspended solids, it's UV transmittance results. So one of the first things that I want to point out is that we always compare to the plant dose of 3 milligrams per liter. So that's kind of like our control. So when you look at all of these lower doses that she tested, so for example, she typically looks at a jar with no polymer in it at all, so it just gets treated with the air. Then she looks at some lower end doses. Like, for example, she did 0.6, 1, on other days went as low as 0.1. But under all these jar tests that she did, effectively you can see that the suspended solids concentration is either lower than or comparable to the concentration for the jar that she ran at the current plant dose. So this effectively means that all of these doses are actually considered to be equal. So you could go as low as 0.6 or 0.1 milligrams per liter of polymer and get the same outcome as in terms of suspended solids removal as the dose that the plant is currently operating. That being said, these are bench scale experiments and they don't consider hydraulics or anything. They're kind of a dump and fill batch style experiment. So to confirm this, you would have to actually, test it under the hydraulic conditions of the plant. But when we look at the figures on the right, so the UVT, you can see the same thing. The plant dose of 3 milligrams per liter gets a UVT of about 60%, and so do all the low doses. So lowering the dose doesn't necessarily improve the UVT, but it or UVT or the solids concentration, but it kind of omits that risk of overdosing polymer and having it in the discharge. So in terms of the reactor assessments that we've been doing, the kind of health or the stress level of the biomass in the reactors is really important for adequate treatment of things like nutrients. And under stressful conditions in the reactors, the bacteria can kind of turn into filamentous type organisms that can cause operational changes in the downstream processes, such as the DAP. So our goal here was to look at the health of the biomass in the reactors using ATP testing, which is a rapid kind of assessment of the biomass concentration and health under the different water quality conditions that are experienced seasonally in Lunenberg, and to identify whether this could be a kind of a tool for more long-term assessment of the health of the reactor. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this using a rapid kind of biomass test that we call ATP. And this ATP test, as I mentioned before, provides a rapid and direct measurement of the concentration of the biomass as well as its health. And through this test kit, there's a number of different parameters that are either directly measured or calculated as a function of the two kind of main ATP measurements, which are total ATP and dissolved ATP. But one of the really valuable indicators that comes out of this test kit is the biomass stress index, and that essentially tells you whether the conditions in the reactor are stressful, which would cause the biomass to be unhealthy and potentially not do kind of the main function that is there for. So just to keep the presentation on the short side, I'm just going to focus on this biomass stress index parameter, which is a calculated value based on the total ATP, which is all of the kind of in the sample in relation to the dissolved ATP, which is the ATP that the cells release on their own ATP. So the dissolved ATP goes up, the biomass stress index increases, and that indicates potential stressful conditions in the reactors. So Sheila, our student who goes to the plant to do all this work, has been doing the ATP testing for quite some time now. So this data shows the ATP or the biomass stress index testing from March all the way to June. And there's a red line here that's indicated at the plot, and that's the recommended level of biomass stress index. It should be below that for what they say is kind of really good process control. And anything above 50% would require some sort of preventative measure or investigation, at least, into what the potential issues in the reactor could be. So you can see that a couple times in March and in April in particular, the stress index is fairly high. And by June, it to go down to well below that 30% target. And this could be the stress that would cause this index to increase for the cells to release that dissolved ATP could be anything from kind of the quality of the wastewater at that time of year being fairly dilute or with low solids, or it could be kind of operational things in the reactors like the flow rate or the mixing in the reactor causing the biomass to kind of shear up of the media in the reactor. But regardless of the cause, the stress index values are lower in June, and we're continuing the testing to see if they're still in those low, under the 30% range conditions. And then finally, with the UV dose experiments that we've been doing, we know that the UV system at the plant might not be providing the appropriate UV dose, and that could be due to a number of things like low transmittance of water entering the reactors, which would be caused by a high solids content. It could also be due to things like fouling of the UV bulbs or adequate sizing of the system overall. So here we were trying to identify what the kind of minimum or appropriate UV dose would be to inform the overall design needs for the disinfection system. So to do this, one of our PhD students, Kyle, would collect samples from the plant and then bring them back to our lab and use this collimated beam apparatus to shine different amounts of UV light on the sample. And then he would measure kind of response parameters, particularly in terms of E. coli, to see how the different amounts of light affects the E. coli concentration in the sample. So he did this last fall a couple of times, and then he repeated it again this summer when the solids content was high. So this figure here shows the E. coli concentration on the y-axis, and then the UV dose that he exposed the samples to on the x-axis. So each sample that he got, he would hit it with 10 millijoules all the way up to 60 and measure the E. coli in the fall and in the summer. And one of the main things that should stand out on this plot is that the fall samples have a much lower E. coli content than the summer samples, which essentially means that due to the high solids content in summer, you need more UV exposure to meet those E. coli discharge limits that are indicated here by the dashed line. So in the fall, this 10 millijoule dose would be determined to be adequate, whereas in the summer, to get that same E. coli concentration, you would need 3 times more UV light exposure. And again, that would most likely be due to the suspended solids content in the summer, which is more than 3 times higher in the summer than it is in the fall. So overall, we found that the polymer dosing could potentially be reduced to less than 0.5 milligrams per liter during the high TSS conditions. We know that the biomass health testing could inform some operational changes to the bioreactors are needed. In particular, we think that there may have been some stressful conditions in the reactors in the spring of 2021 in March and April, as indicated by the high biomass stress index. And this could impact the downstream DAF process in terms of the clarification. And finally, regular testing, the more frequent testing could become kind of part of the general process performance monitoring. So we did this once a week when possible, but more regular testing would provide a better picture of the overall health of the biomass. And Sheila's continuing that testing as we speak. And then finally, the collimated beam studies indicated that the high solids content in the summer essentially requires more UV light exposure to meet those E. coli targets. And that's everything that I have today, but if you guys have any questions, you can feel free to ask them, or you can email me or anyone on the team to ask questions that might come up later.
Thank you, Lindsay. Are there any questions for Lindsay
No problem.
Of council? All right, seeing none, we will move on to the long-term wastewater treatment plant report presented by Sarah Enslin of CBCL.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, councillors, for this opportunity today. Joining me remotely are Nick Moriarty, Process Specialist, and Erica Hart, Process EIT. I would also like to thank the approximately 26 CBCL staff members who worked on the project as a whole, and the town engineering and operations team. Next slide, please. Okay, the presentation today will be an update on the long-term expansion plan, and this is the last draft report to be presented. Next slide, please. Just as a quick refresher, I'm going to give you a tour of the plant. The effluent comes into the headworks where large solids and gravel and grit are removed in the bottom left-hand corner, and then it passes to the bioreactor tanks where organic matter is removed using bacteria on the media in the tanks. It then goes through to the DAFs, the dissolved air flotation units, where solids are removed, and that's in the bottom right-hand corner. And from there, the effluent goes to the UV disinfection for disinfection and inactivation of the bacteria, and out to the outfall via the effluent pumps. Solids that are skimmed off the top in the dissolved air flotation units are sent to the sludge dewatering via the sludge holding tank for dewatering and disposal off-site. Okay, next slide, please. The planned Project Lunenberg expansion would see an additional 50% population growth. So the plant would need to receive wastewater from approximately 1,100 more people within the next 40 years, according to that plan. And that would increase the total population to over 3,000. This would also increase the loading that comes to the plant. So while there is quite a bit of opportunity to reduce the flows at the same time by strategic sewer separation to maintain the average and peak flows reaching the plant per day, it would make the wastewater stronger. And that's what we've used for design criteria, is a 50% increase in loading. So both of organic matter and solids. And all of these options do assume that the flows can be controlled through strategic sewer separation and also stormwater exclusion. And if that is not the case or not the preferred way forward, then some of the options would need to change to increase capacity in other places. And with the increased wastewater strength, it would be an average increase in wastewater strength throughout the year. Next slide, please. So we looked at 5 different options for a plant expansion. The first one uses the existing equipment to the greatest extent possible. And this is a moving bed bioreactor using the existing dissolved air flotation units, or DAFs. So at the moment, the bacteria in the moving bed bioreactor are growing on plastic media that looks like this. And it's quite large, but there is potential to, by replacing it with smaller media with a greater surface area per piece of media and per volume, to increase the organic capacity, organics removal capacity by a factor of 10. So 10 times more in area in the existing tanks. And this would greatly increase the organics removal potential of the plant. And then it would go forward to the existing DAF units where these still have capacity. They have spare capacity at the moment to take the increased strength wastewater. This would involve the least disruption to the existing plant because most of the equipment would be reused. And it also has, sorry, I'm just going to grab the paper slides. It also has a very low geotechnical risk because it doesn't involve building any new buildings. Operationally, it's what the operators are already used to, although it would have some improved controls, but it cannot resolve the existing operational difficulties with cleaning the existing DAFs, which have lamella plates in them. It still uses polymer, although as you saw from the previous presentation by Dalhousie, there is potential to lower the polymer dose so as to reduce the effect of the polymer leaving the plant. And this also has a regulatory risk in that it pushes the existing DAF units closer to their total capacity, and therefore at times under peak loading, there is a risk that they would be beyond their design capacity and not meet regulatory limits. From a construction perspective, this one is the simplest, and it also has the lowest scope of work overall. Each of these options would assume that the relevant near-term items were completed, and each of them also, in order to increase the solids dewatering capacity, adds a third channel to the existing Fournier press. There's room to put that on. It was by design that it's expandable, and that would be used for each of these options. Okay, next slide, please. This next option includes the upgrades with the first option of using smaller media and a greater surface area in the bioreactors, but it also replaces the dissolved air filtration units with new ones. These have some advantages in that they don't have the lamella plates that cause difficulty cleaning them out, and they also have a dedicated flocculation zone. So because of that, they don't need to use polymer all of the time. It can be dosed only when needed, which would reduce the polymer use and the polymer risk, but they do still need to use polymer periodically. This would expand the DAF capacity to the required for the expansion. And another advantage is that the whole process could come from one supplier, which would be one point of contact if there was something going wrong with any of the major core pieces of equipment in the treatment process. This one, however, does have quite a complicated construction sequence. It doesn't have geotechnical risk, but it would require removing sections of the process room roof in order to use a crane to remove the existing DAFs and put in the new ones. And there are some fairly complicated tie-ins associated with that too. The new DAFs would be taller than the existing ones, and so it would no longer be possible to flow by gravity from the bioreactor to the DAFs, and it would need an extra set of pumps in between to put the flow through the DAFs. From a regulatory perspective, this would be fairly similar to option one, although with a slight advantage in terms of DAF capacity. Okay, next slide, please. The third option is a sequencing batch reactor, and this is a completely different type of process. Instead of using bacteria that are attached to plastic media, as in the moving bed bioreactor, this uses free-floating bacteria, and both the organics removal and solids removal take place in the same tank in sequence. So the tank fills up with wastewater, and it's mixed with bacteria that are in the tank. And then this is aerated so that the bacteria can remove the organic matter. And once that reaction is complete, the aeration stops and the solids and bacteria all settle out within the tank. And the top clear liquid is decanted from the top of the tank. This would then go to an equalization tank from where it would be pumped through the existing UV system for disinfection. And it would also reuse the existing bioreactor tank for a sludge holding tank. So operationally, this one, although it's quite different than existing, is also something that's quite reliable and isn't very complicated for operators to learn how to use. So this is a robust process that can adjust to the variations in influent that the plant receives, and that the operators would be able to learn how to use effectively and operate well. From a regulatory perspective, this one has low regulatory risk because it can produce better effluent quality than the plant currently can. And it also does that in a reliable way. Even if the regulations tightened, there would still be some spare capacity for this system to meet the regulatory requirements. Construction-wise, there are some significant risks because it requires 2 large new tanks to be constructed on the site behind the bioreactor building. And the geotechnical characteristics of the entire site are such that they would need to be carefully investigated with a geotechnical investigation and then mitigated to make sure that the tanks could be successfully installed. There might be better or worse locations on the site, and there's also the possibility of changing the tank geometry to some degree in order to optimize the cost of mitigating the poor geotechnical conditions from the previous use as a landfill. With this option, there would be no polymer use and the DAFs would be removed altogether. So not all of the near-term items would be relevant for this option. Next slide, please. The fourth option is a membrane bioreactor. And this one also uses free-floating bacteria in a tank, but instead for the solids removal, once the organics removal is completed, then the water is pushed through a membrane, through which the water can pass, but the bacteria and the solids cannot go through. So they're recycled back to the head of the plant to seed the incoming wastewater, and the clear effluent is passed forward to disinfection. This one has the best effluent quality out of all of the options that we're looking at today, and it has therefore very low regulatory risk because it can meet and exceed any foreseeable regulatory limits. But operationally, it is quite a bit more complicated than some of the others. It would probably require more staff and would also likely require a class 3 operator for the plant instead of the current class 2. Class 3 operators can be difficult to come by because there aren't a lot of them. And it would mean either supporting the current operator in upgrading to class 3 or to recruit a new class 3 operator. There is also a process risk operationally from screening and chemicals affecting the membranes. So in this one, not only does the near-term option of an upgraded screen need to be installed, but also an additional even finer screen to go with it afterwards in order to protect the membranes from stringy material getting through, because these can damage the membranes. The membranes in any case need to be regularly cleaned to keep them in good condition. And they also need to be periodically replaced approximately every 10 years. And so a replacement program would need to be in place to make sure that this was done as needed. This one also has, from a construction perspective, a high geotechnical risk because there's a new building required on the site and new tanks, and they are almost as large as the SBR option. So it's similar in magnitude to the SBR and would need careful evaluation and mitigation to build the extra equipment in that location. It also has increased operation costs because of the additional equipment required. Next slide, please. The fifth option is a combination of option 1 with a polishing disc filter. So this again uses all of the existing equipment, but in order to improve the effluent quality and lower the regulatory risk, it has a disc filter which can remove additional solids and also remove any polymer that might carry over from the existing DAFs. So from an operational perspective, this one uses the same process that the operators are familiar with, but then it adds another piece of equipment, which we anticipate they could also operate within the same amount of staffing, but it does add some cost and some additional tasks. And this one has a very low risk of polymer and solids carryover. And so from a regulatory perspective, it can lower the risk significantly. And it could also meet some tightening of regulatory standards and could in fact be built in the future at the time when the plant needed that additional performance. It also has a higher geotechnical risk than options 1 and 2, but not as high as the SBR and the MBR because those both involve a much larger building. In this case, the effluent would be pumped up to a new building behind the bioreactor building, which would house the disc filter, and then downstream of the disc filter, the UV to improve disinfection performance and reduce maintenance. And from there, it would be pumped out to the outfall. Next slide, please. When we compare all of these options, we've compared them on a few different aspects. There's the capital cost, which is the opinion of probable capital cost for each of these options. It includes as well a design development contingency for unforeseen items that are encountered during the design process, and also a construction contingency for unforeseen items encountered during the construction period, as well as an engineering allowance. So when comparing the capital cost, there is a significantly lower capital cost for option 1 as compared to the other options because it involves many fewer changes to the plant. However, on an operational cost basis, there is an advantage for the SBR, the sequencing batch reactor, because it has less equipment to maintain and also does not use any chemicals in the process. As a counterpoint, the membrane bioreactor needs chemicals for cleaning, even though it doesn't use polymer, and also takes quite a bit more energy. So that one has the highest operational cost. As well, from a technological fit, the SBR, seems to be the best option. And that one is also favorable in terms of regulatory and operations risk. It does have a moderate level of construction risk, but that could be mitigated through careful design and investigation during the design period. Next slide, please. When looking in combination at the expansion and also the near-term items, not all of the near-term items are relevant for each option. So there are somewhat reduced near-term item costs for option 3, the SBR, and option 4, the MBR, as compared to option 1, which requires the full near-term item allowance of $3.6 million. So the total cost of option 1 would, in our opinion of probable cost, would be $5.2 million. The combined option cost of option 2 with new DAFs would be 9.1 million. The combined option cost of option 3 around 8.9 million. Combined option cost of the MBR option 4, 10.4 million. And the MBBR with disc filter option 1A would be 9.7 million. So options 2 and 3 are quite close in cost. Options 1 has the lowest cost, and option 4 has the highest cost on a capital cost basis. Now, these are just looking at straight capital costs, and they don't account for any differences in timing of these expenses. Next slide, please. After doing a detailed Kepner-Trago decision analysis process with town staff and also with the engineering team, we recommend that the SBR is the best expansion option for the town at this point. The key reasons include that it has very reliable operations that are highly automated. It can successfully adapt to changes in influent conditions. It doesn't require any polymer, which has been a long-standing issue in the harbor. And it's widely used in the Maritimes, so there are other plants nearby that have similar processes and similar operations staff from which these staff could ask questions and gain knowledge. It also has the advantage of having reduced operational costs, which is something that the town will bear all to. The town has to pay the entire operational cost, even though there can be funding available for capital costs. And it has a low risk of odor as well as reasonable construction tie-ins. There is one substantial risk, which is the geotechnical conditions on the site in general. And these would need to be thoroughly investigated and then designed around in order to make sure that the plant was successful in that location. Next slide, please. The next steps include sending the conceptual design report to Nova Scotia Environment for their comment, and then to continue with things that the town is already doing, like influent sampling and the seawater exclusion work, and then to develop a plan for the near-term items and how those can be combined or done ahead of time as makes the most sense, and developing a plan for strategic sewer separation to reduce the amount of stormwater in the sewer. Following that, to apply for funding from senior government, and then to procure and carry out pre-design of the SBR expansion, including a geotechnical investigation at that stage. Okay, next slide, please. A possible schedule for this plant expansion involves applying for funding in approximately spring 2022, once the plans for near-term items and sewer separation have been put together. And then once the funding has been approved, to go forward with pre-design, including geotechnical investigation, and then to send that pre-design report to NSE to keep them involved and know what is going on so that the regulatory process is smoother. Following that, detailed design and a regulatory application for approval, and then tendering construction around spring 2024, with construction during that year of 2024 and commissioning and operation in winter 2025. Now that's based on applying for funding perhaps in 2022. And if the town did not want to go forward with the expansion plan right away, then it would be possible to just delay that application and also delay each of the steps in turn. Next slide, please. Okay. And that concludes my presentation of the long-term expansion. I would now welcome any questions.
Okay, are there any questions of council for Sarah? I see Councillor Sanford first.
Through the chair, I don't have a question for Sarah, but I think it's for the CAO or perhaps for our engineer. Do we currently have a sewer separation plan? I know we've done work on separating water and sewer, so I'm thinking we already have a plan.
I have Mr. Tillard on the line. I'll defer to Dennis, the town engineer, your worship,
Thank you.
rather than have me bumble through that. Yes, but.
Dennis?
Yes, so we do have a separation plan. We had a study executed last year regarding saltwater intrusion that the CBCL executed for us, and we identified a variety of places in which we can that we have to do some work in order to stop the infiltration of salt water into the system. So that there was, I think, for 4 areas identified, that there was two aspects that we've already taken care of. There was a leakage that we fixed into Tannery Road, and also leakage that we fixed at the new catch basin that was installed on Brook Street. We've also identified 3 check valves to be installed at 3 lift stations into town, but where we identified some salt water coming in through the overflow line. And there was also some leakage I identified, and we have a scope of work to execute to do some work with the Blue Nose Drive collection line.
One last question, just for clarity. So is the saltwater intrusion plan different than the sewer separation plan? Because I'm thinking the sewer separation plan is water. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So we have identified scopes on the sewer separation. Ian might be able to help you more with the details with this. He was involved in it in the past, but that has to do with making sure that we try and get the houses within town to be able to separate there's the storm water from going into the sewer system, and we're going to have to act upon that actively here in order to make that happen. So, and I'm not sure, Ian, what was there other scopes as far as that there was some other scopes, but I just can't recall.
Yes, hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, I can.
Get away from back. There were a number of issues that were identified in terms of the separation. We've had identified a few smaller projects, I guess, as part of the Brook Street upgrades in the adjacent areas, and they've been included in this year's budget and in future budgets. There are, I think, 4 different smaller scale projects. We're also looking at a stormwater separation plan in terms of rainwater coming off buildings, and so that's a program that was it's not a construction project per se for the town, but it is an initiative to encourage homeowners and building owners to get their rainwater out of our sewer. And thirdly, there's a longer term look at this, and that's really starts off with the master planning, which is has been approved for in next year's budget to get that work started. And that is developing a model of the entire collection system so that we can actually in future be able to analyze accurately where all the flows are coming from, where all of the watersheds are draining into our system, and to start looking at the prioritizing items from that in future years can contribute to storms operation.
Question? Councilor Halverson?
Thank you. Through to Sarah. I'm curious whether, well, first off, I'm glad to see that option 3 was a recommended option. The polymer ones are kind of a non-starter for me. But on option 3, would this still tie into the existing biomass filter to help further reduce odor?
Yes, it would still use the existing biofilter for odor control.
Okay. And by selecting this option, now we're also deliberating, an outflow pipe. Is there, I guess that was that taken into consideration too when this option was recommended, and what are the advantages this option has that is beneficial to that process?
Yes, this option is a good match for the proposed relocated outfall. It will give better effluent quality in the harbor, and there's 2 aspects there. The plant itself will produce better quality effluent to reduce the amount of organics and solids going into the harbor, and then the relocated location will also improve the dispersion so it mixes in better, and it would also give most likely improved disinfection, especially with the additional UV bank.
Deputy Mayor.
Oh, thank you, Worship. Sarah, this has been a long and tiresome journey, hasn't it? and I must say, no polymer, low cost operation, and kind of a tank of a system, pardon the pun, right? I am very happy to endorse this. I'm pleased that you brought forward this recommendation. And I'm probably one of your worst nightmares in these meetings.
No, not at all, Councillor Mosher. Thank you very much.
Any further questions from Council? Councillor Ernst?
Thank you. Just one regarding capacity for a little extra clarity. So I'm very glad to see that you've taken into our sort of future hopeful plans for Project Lunenberg and so on, and increased capacity in town. Is the current situation for the population as it stands right now, or do we have some room for the very large tourist season that I don't know what percentage it's added to the town population at that time, but it's certainly an increased capacity. Does that get included into this as well?
Yes, absolutely. That's also included. So the existing tourist load is already being treated by the current plant. And so this would be an increase from the current plant loading, and also including a proportional increase for the summertime peak load that comes from the tourism that's so important to the town.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any further questions from Council? Councillor Sanford?
I think this might go through the chair to Sarah. I'm just wondering if we invest 8.9 million in this new adventure if we went down the road of option 3. Do we have any idea how long that will last us before we have to do another major investment?
Typically, mechanical and electrical items will last for about 20 years. And at that point, we would anticipate that some of the equipment would need to be evaluated or possibly replaced. But concrete tanks last much longer than that, 60 years or more. And so those would still be in good condition at the end of 20 years and would be able to continue their life. So that gives a long-lived asset, along with some that will need to be checked and possibly worked on in about 20 years' time.
Any further questions of council? All right, I have a few, although some of them have been already asked. So Sarah, assuming, a 20 to 60 year life cycle for any of the given components of option 3, I'm just wondering, what would the growth capacity potentially max out at in terms of population, like roughly?
Well, it's designed for the 40-year build out of Project Lunenberg. So an increase from current population of approximately 50%.
Yeah.
That is approximate. So it may be able to handle more. It would depend on how much tourism grew, also on whether the regulatory conditions had changed during that time, whether they were as they are now or tighter. So at the end of approximately 40 years, you'd want to look at what the capacity of the plant remaining really was and see whether it made sense to try to increase the capacity further or whether it was still adequate.
And usage rates, depending on how much we would separate storm and sewer. So there are other ways. It just seems quite fixed, once you've done these plant upgrades. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
Both, I can see the ability to add capacity if it's necessary. Being an optimist, I hope we overshoot our population projections. And on the off chance that we were to do that, I'm just wondering what options we would have available, right? Rather than, obviously trying to control usage rates better and strategically separating storm and sewer. Is there any ability, should the need arise, to be a bit more modular or to expand plant capacity through the sequencing batch reactor process?
Yes, it is possible to add more tanks to a sequencing batch reactor. So the municipality of Colchester has done that. They added another tank, and that is a possibility that could be done here, especially if the layout plans for eventual possible expansion.
Yeah.
So, yes.
So in the same way with the DAF, you can just add more DAF media. This way you just have more tank capacity.
The DAF option is actually more limited because there isn't space in the building to add another DAF unit. The space you have would be completely taken up by the 2 DAFs at the increased capacity. So in that respect, the SBR actually gives additional expansion.
Flexibility.
Yeah, expansion capacity.
Sold. Any further questions from council? All right, seeing none at this stage and there being no further business, I'll declare the meeting adjourned.